he looked me dead in the eye, in front of our entire boardroom, and said, "No one wants a fat, ugly woman representing our company. You're not CEO material, you're embarrassing." Then he signed the divorce papers and had security drag me out of my own office. But what he didn't know, I was pregnant, and I had just closed the deal that would make this company a billion-dollar empire. We built everything together, brick by brick, sleepless night after sleepless night. When we started the company from our cramped 2-bedroom apartment, we didn't have a single investor, barely had enough savings for rent, and ate noodles 5 nights a week. I handled branding, strategy, and marketing while he worked on logistics and finances. We were a team. Or so I believed. I gave up my career to support his dream because I thought it was our dream. We survived those early years of struggle, pitching to disinterested investors, dealing with failed prototypes, and even going into debt to keep things afloat. Through every setback, I stood beside him, determined to build something meaningful not just for us, but for the future we imagined. Then success came, and everything changed. As the company scaled, his attitude shifted. The man who once celebrated my creativity, who called me the soul of the startup, now barely acknowledged my presence in board meetings. When reporters started interviewing us for magazine features, he cut me out of the narratives entirely. "They don't want to hear from both of us," he said, brushing me off like an assistant. He became colder. He started working late without explanation, avoiding conversations, avoiding me. When I brought it up, he'd sigh dramatically and say, "You're too sensitive. Focus on the company." But the worst part wasn't his silence. It was the criticism that crept into every corner of our life. Suddenly, the way I dressed was unprofessional. The way I spoke in meetings was too emotional. He nitpicked everything about me, my appearance, my weight, even the way I laughed. I was no longer the partner he relied on. I was a flaw in his perfect image. One morning over breakfast, he casually said, "You should really consider hiring a stylist. You can't keep showing up to meetings looking like this." His tone was sharp, devoid of any affection. I thought it was stress. I thought he was overwhelmed by pressure, media, investors. So I worked harder. I redesigned our brand identity, launched a new product line, even secured a meeting with one of the top venture capital firms in the country. I believed that if I just proved my worth again, he'd remember who I was to him. But I was wrong. He had already moved on, from me, from the partnership, from everything we built. The turning point came at the Global CEO Council retreat. It was our golden ticket, a chance to connect with elite investors, world-changing innovators, media moguls. I spent months preparing for it. I crafted presentations, coordinated strategies, and rehearsed speeches till my voice cracked. It was the moment I had dreamed of since the beginning. But the night before we were supposed to fly out, I came down the stairs wearing the dress I had saved for years, elegant, powerful, confident, and he looked up at me with a sneer. "You're not seriously wearing that, are you?" he said, setting his glass down. "You look like a puffed-up balloon. These are billionaires, not your book club. Do me a favor, stay home." I froze. The air collapsed out of my lungs. I had no words. Just silence, and shame. His tone was final, dismissive, humiliating. I tried to push back, to remind him of the work I had done, the importance of the retreat, but he cut me off with a cold glare. "This is why no one takes you seriously. You don't have the look, the presence. You're a liability. This company deserves better." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room alone, staring at the glowing city skyline while he packed and left without a second glance. My chest was heavy, but my mind raced. There had to be something more going on. The next morning, I logged into our shared business accounts, and found it. Hidden among the legal files was a drafted transfer agreement. He was selling majority ownership to himself. Quietly, secretly, he had been reassigning shares, shifting power, and removing my legal standing as co-founder. Everything we built, he was stealing it out from under me. I felt like I was drowning. I called our lawyer, my hands shaking. But it got worse. The following Monday, I arrived at the office early, ready to fight, but the front desk had already been instructed not to let me in. My access was revoked. My name was gone from the executive suite. And then, I saw the headline on the company's website. Founder and CEO, his name, expands vision for future innovation. There was no mention of me. Not even in the Our Story section I had written myself. He had erased me. When I confronted him in the hallway, his voice was cold, almost amused. "You're not CEO material," he said with a smirk. "You don't have the look, the charisma, or the discipline. Investors want someone who looks the part. And you? You're too fat, too emotional, and too weak to lead anything." In that moment, something inside me shattered, but something else woke up. I stared at him, not with tears, but with a strange, burning calm. Because I knew something he didn't. While he was busy manipulating image and ego, I had quietly built something he couldn't erase. My network, my proof, my voice. He thought he had silenced me. He thought he had won. But he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated the woman who made him powerful in the first place. He thought he had buried me. Thought his words would silence me. Thought stripping my title and humiliating me in front of the world would send me crawling into a corner. But he didn't know who I had become in the years of building this empire. I wasn't just the wife behind the curtain. I was the architect of the vision, the heartbeat of the brand, the reason clients trusted us. And more importantly, I wasn't stupid. While he focused on appearances, I had quietly prepared for the day he would try to cut me out. You see, months earlier, something had felt off. His sudden interest in meetings without me. The locked folders on our shared drive. The shady lawyer friend he kept meeting in private. So I began documenting everything. Every decision, every conversation, every strategic plan. I took screenshots. I recorded calls. I made copies of our legal filings, and I consulted a separate attorney, someone loyal to me alone. I even had the patent for our flagship product filed under my name. He never noticed. He was too drunk on ego. But the biggest piece of the puzzle? I had secured a silent investor, one of the most respected venture capitalists in the tech world. I had met her during a women-led innovation summit where I was the keynote speaker. She'd pulled me aside afterward and said, "Your brain belongs at the top. If you ever want to build something of your own, I'll fund it." Back then, I was still loyal to my marriage. But I kept her number. Just in case. The day he removed me from the company, I didn't fight back. Not yet. I needed the timing to be right. He believed the company was his now, his playground to control. But what he didn't know was that the buyout offer, the $120 million deal that would launch us into the global market, wasn't with him. It was with me. He hadn't even been in the room when it was negotiated. The investor, trusting my leadership and my vision, had signed the deal directly to me. Legally. Fully. And it was all documented. When the company scheduled a major board meeting to announce the future direction under his leadership, I requested an emergency shareholders meeting. With the evidence in hand, I invoked my legal right as a co-founder and shareholder. At first, he laughed it off. "You don't have the votes," he smirked. "You don't even have a seat at the table anymore." But when the board saw my evidence, the original design rights, the patent ownership, the audio recordings of him admitting he wanted to remove me because of my appearance, they didn't laugh. I stood in that boardroom, the same room where he once said I embarrassed him, and calmly placed a USB drive on the table. "This contains every product concept and IP filing tied to my name," I said. "Every client relationship was built through my pitch decks. Every investor touchpoint, every product launch, every marketing campaign, mine. I built this. And if you continue to let him run it, you're not only supporting discrimination, you're risking the legal ownership of your entire foundation." The silence in the room was suffocating. He turned red. Furious. "She's bluffing," he barked. But the general counsel had already reviewed the files. "She's not," the lawyer said quietly. She owns more than you do. And then the twist came like a thunderclap. One of the major board members, our original seed investor, stood up and said, I always knew she was the real deal. I vote to reinstate her as CEO effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. He had no leverage left. No support. Not even the investor who once praised his leadership stood beside him. He tried to protest, threatened lawsuits, shouted obscenities. But it didn't matter. The board escorted him out, just like he had once ordered security to do to me. And as he passed me on the way out, our eyes locked. He looked at me with a mix of rage and disbelief. Like he couldn't fathom that the woman he called too fat and too ugly had just outsmarted him in front of the entire power circle he once ruled. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I didn't just take back my company, I took back myself. The days following the boardroom showdown were nothing short of surreal. I sat alone in the office that was once mine, stripped of its warmth and identity, as if it had been converted into a showroom for ego and glassy surfaces. Everything I had designed, the cozy corner shelves filled with business books, the framed vision statements, the calming art pieces, had been removed and replaced with sterile masculinity. I didn't recognize the space anymore. But I didn't cry. I rolled up my sleeves and reclaimed it, not just the room, but the spirit it once held. The first thing I did was call a full company-wide meeting. I didn't stand behind a podium. I stood in the center of the room, among the people, the developers, designers, marketers, many of whom had grown cold and disengaged under his reign of intimidation. They looked unsure, confused, some even skeptical. And I told them the truth. I told them that leadership isn't about the sharpness of a suit or the arrogance of a voice. It's about creating, believing, and holding space for others to grow. I'm not here to rebuild what we had, I said firmly. I'm here to build something better, something that reflects all of us. I made bold changes. I introduced a flexible work model and appointed a new innovation team led entirely by women and minority talent, people who had been overlooked, like I had been. I reopened communication channels that had been shut down and removed toxic department heads who had aligned with his fear-based leadership. And slowly, something began to shift. People started smiling again in the hallways. Teams collaborated with excitement instead of anxiety. Clients returned not just because our product was good, but because they believed in what we stood for. But perhaps the most important thing I did was return to my roots, the vision. I started visiting every department, from engineering to customer care, listening to frustrations and hopes. I worked late again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I rolled up my sleeves and joined brainstorming sessions. I brought back the energy of those early startup nights, when it wasn't about who got credit, but about building something meaningful. Slowly, the soul of the company, the one we lost when greed took over, began to return. And as the company rose again under my leadership, the world noticed. Press outlets who once only quoted my ex-husband began reaching out for interviews with me. Industry panels invited me to speak on resilience, leadership, and the future of innovation. Not as the ex-wife of the former CEO, but as the woman who took back her seat at the table and rebuilt the company from the inside out. Still, I didn't let revenge consume me. I didn't sue him, though I could have. I didn't release the recordings to the public, though they would have gone viral. I didn't tarnish his name in the media. Because dignity is a language only the truly strong speak fluently. And I had already won where it mattered most, in silence, in stability, in building something he could never destroy again. But it wasn't all business. Behind the scenes, I was preparing for a new chapter, not just professionally, but personally. Months earlier, during the height of his betrayal, I had found out I was pregnant. I never told him. I didn't want him to weaponize the child the way he weaponized power. And so, in quiet strength, I carried my son alone. And when he was born, I looked into his eyes and whispered, "You will never be made to feel small for who you are. Not by anyone." He became my reason. On the days I wanted to collapse under pressure, I remembered that little heartbeat inside me when I was being thrown out of my own office. On the nights I questioned if I could lead again, I reminded myself that I was already leading the most important life I ever would, his. And now? He's 4 years old. Bold, brilliant, and kind. He walks the halls of the headquarters holding my hand, waving at employees who all know his name. And every time he looks up at me with his wide, curious eyes and says, "Mama, you're the boss," I feel a rush of pride no boardroom, no spotlight, no title could ever match. Because the real victory wasn't in reclaiming a company. It was in reclaiming myself. It's strange how healing often arrives in quiet moments, not with thunder, but with stillness. Not through revenge, but through peace. Years passed, and life didn't just move on, it evolved. The chaos faded, the headlines disappeared, and the wounds, though deep, began to close like old pages of a painful book. But some scars never fully fade. They live with you, reminders of who you were, what you endured, and the fire you walked through to become someone stronger. There were nights when the silence of my home felt like a haunting echo. I'd sit by the window, watching the city breathe beneath the moonlight, and wonder how I had ever allowed myself to be defined by someone else's cruelty. I remembered the look in his eyes the day he called me too fat, too ugly, as if love had an expiration date and self-worth could be measured by appearances. That memory used to hurt. Now, it fuels me. Because every time I look in the mirror, I no longer see the woman he tried to break. I see the woman who rose, with dignity, with defiance, with purpose. My son is the living proof of that purpose. Every morning, when he runs into my room, his little arms wrapped around my neck shouting, "Mama, let's go build your company today!" I feel a kind of success no trophy, no press release, no $1 million deal could match. He doesn't care what the world once said about me. He doesn't see the weight I carried, or the judgments I endured. He sees a mother who stands tall, who smiles without fear, and who shows up, every single day, for him and for herself. I remember one evening, after I tucked him into bed, he looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Mama, why don't I have a daddy like the other kids?" My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I felt that old ache, the sting of abandonment and betrayal. But then I smiled gently, ran my fingers through his soft hair, and whispered, "Because God knew you only needed a strong mom. And I've got enough love for both of us." That night I cried, not out of sorrow, but out of release. I had spent so long trying to prove my worth, to reclaim my place, to show the world I wasn't what he called me. But the truth was, I never had to prove anything. I was always enough. It just took losing everything to finally believe it. Years later, when I received the award for CEO of the Year from a global leadership summit, I stood on that stage in front of thousands. Cameras flashed, applause thundered, and yet, in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the crowd. I was thinking about the woman who once sat in a hallway, crying in a torn dress, feeling like the world had ended. And I wished I could go back in time and hold her, tell her, "You're not broken. You're just beginning." I held the award in my hand, but I dedicated it to every woman who was ever told she wasn't enough. To every woman who was belittled, humiliated, replaced, discarded. I spoke not with anger, but with truth. "They will try to shame you," I said. "They will say you're too much, too loud, too soft, too emotional, too ambitious, too fat, too ugly, too bold. But let them talk. Because the world doesn't need less of you. It needs every inch of you." When I walked off that stage, I wasn't just celebrated. I was seen. For the first time in my life, I was no longer hiding behind someone else's spotlight. I was standing in my own light, a light I had built, nurtured, and protected, even when the world tried to dim it. And as I stepped into the lobby, I saw my son waiting there with a bouquet of wildflowers in his tiny hands. He ran to me, beaming, and said, "Mama, you're my superhero." In that moment, everything became clear. It was never about revenge. It was about redemption. It was never about proving him wrong. It was about proving me right. And it was never about just being the CEO. It was about becoming the kind of woman who doesn't just survive betrayal. She builds an empire from it. And loves harder because of it. And raises kings who will never repeat the sins of the past. Because this isn't just a story about being thrown away. It's a story about what happens when you rise again, stronger, wiser, softer, louder. And you look the world in the eye and say, "You didn't break me. You built me." Do the like and subscribe my channel for more interesting videos.